Welcome to this live cast on our future economies. Capitalism, despite the tremendous increase in worldwide welfare through its innovative power and freedom, has at the same time a number of negative consequences. A transition is necessary to overcome ecological destruction, decrease in quality of life, and growing inequality. Given geopolitical developments, Europe has an important role to play in this transition. In the livecasts, we will start an open dialogue and discuss this transition with internationally renowned economists from all over the world. Questions will pass by, such as: each week, we will discuss these matters with 2 economists, resulting in 10 online dialogues in 10 weeks, where we will share viewpoints and collect ideas on how capitalism's innovative and creative powers can go hand in hand with fostering an equal and just society. A different subject every week. Together we can build a basis for economies that are beneficial to all of us. You can participate by putting your questions and remarks in the chat. So, let's talk.
Welcome everybody to this first edition of the series The Future of Capitalism, a series initiated and designed by Moral Markets in collaboration with Pakhuis de Zwijger. And in this edition we will focus on how to battle inequality and deal with the ecological crisis in Europe. And we will also discuss what obstacles we have to overcome to reach a more sustainable European economy. And for that, we have invited 3 guests. The first is here in the studio, Elisa Terragno Bogliacini, and she's a researcher at Our New Economy, and she will give an opening statement on behalf of a think tank of young economists. And after that, my co-host, David van Overbeek, will first interview the Nobel Prize winner, American economist, professor at Columbia University, author of many books, and so honored that he's here with us, although through the online world, Joseph Stiglitz. And after that, David van Overbeek will interview Herman van Rompuy, who is also an economist, but was the former Prime Minister of Belgium and the first President of the European Council. And also for his presence, we're very proud. Okay, subsequently, after these 2 interviews, we will have a deep dive, a conversation with these 2 gentlemen, and hopefully also with you, the viewer, who we will give the floor if you have interesting questions. How you can do that? If you're only watching the live stream, you should go to the program page at Pakhuis de Zwijger, the site of Pakhuis de Zwijger, and go to the program page of What Really Matters in Markets. And then you have to press the webinar through Zoom. And if you're in that environment, you can ask questions in the Q&A button, with the Q&A button. And we will receive these questions here live in the studio. And you have the opportunity. I don't have a daily opportunity to ask a Nobel Prize winner questions, but you can do it today. Use that very democratic thing which we now offer to you. Please help us ask these brilliant men the right questions the coming hour. Okay. Let's start, and we'll do that, as I already mentioned, with the young economist and researcher at Our New Economy, Elisa Terragno Bogliacini.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you. Many of us have heard the term going back to normal, meaning to go back to the way things were before the corona crisis hit. To uncertain career prospects, a lack of housing opportunities, and a rising threat of natural disasters? We say no, thanks. Mariana Mazzucato put it nicely in an article on Project Syndicate in March 2020. The triple crisis of capitalism: the health corona crisis, the financial crisis, and the climate crisis. The implications of these are severe. They are real, and they're here. One of our speakers today, Professor Stiglitz, recently published a survey with the Oxford University Smith School, focusing on how fiscal recovery packages can simultaneously tackle the corona crisis as well as the climate crisis. As a part of the Moral Markets Initiative, we also recently published a policy report, which, inspired by that of Stiglitz and his co-authors, proposes a set of public investments for the Netherlands, attempting to reconcile economic recovery, climate action, as well as tackling social inequalities. In Europe, we find a couple of examples of a willingness to change towards a more sustainable version of capitalism. Germany and France, for example, have allocated 50 and 30 billion euro respectively for recovery packages focused specifically on climate action. And the European Commission is also pushing in this direction with its European Green Deal. However, the Netherlands seems to be lagging behind. Precisely 2 weeks ago, the Dutch government announced the launch of a national growth fund, which makes available 20 billion euro for investing in innovation, R&D, and infrastructure in the next 5 years. As the name suggests, the fund is focused on long-run GDP growth. It is explicitly not meant to focus on short-term employment, and ecological sustainability is also not included as a goal. There seems to be a disconnect between promises and claims about climate justice and actual actions. But can we truly blame politicians for choosing the usual go-to solutions for economic recovery? Why worry about changing the structural composition of the system if we can also just create growth and jobs? This is the topic that we want to address today. How can we reconcile short-term economic recovery with a long-term ambition for structural change? How can we envision and embrace a different future for the market economy, one that will truly serve the people? My co-author Sam de Maunik and I would like to suggest a couple of specific ideas on which you could help us reflect. First, rising unemployment in the months and possibly years to come seems to be inevitable. A prominent idea, often associated with modern monetary theory, to tackle the issue of unemployment is a job guarantee, in which the government would act as an employer of last resort by hiring unemployed workers. Secondly, the distributional aspects of climate policies are often an important issue, with the Yellow Vest movement in France as a key example. A popular idea is to spend carbon tax revenues on lower income groups to prevent this type of taxation from being regressive. Thirdly, the corona crisis has caused us to live even more in digital spaces than we already did. While this might lead to some positive outcomes, such as reduced pollution to less traveling, there are also some dangers to this. One issue is that of the excessive power concentration in a few digital firms, such as Amazon, Google, or Facebook. To tackle this issue, in the book Angrynomics, Eric Lonergan and Mark Blythe recently proposed the idea of a data dividend. Companies have to pay users for the data they provide, either through one-off royalty payments or data licenses granted for a few decades. Finally, given Europe's concern for democracy and sympathy for the welfare state, would you agree that it could provide the right political environment to bring about these policies? Or do you believe it will inevitably make us gravitate back to normal? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Elisa. And let's go to our other two speakers, and with very much pleasure, I give the floor to you, David.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stiglitz, I'd like to start with you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. In this series, we are discussing the future of finance, and tonight we are focusing on Europe specifically. In 2016, you wrote a book about the euro, and more recently, a report came out emphasizing the necessity to rewrite the rules of the European economy. You have written extensively about Europe and the EU, which is quite remarkable for an American economist. What do you find so interesting about Europe and its economy?
Well, I think Europe has so many things that are so important for everybody in the world. The commitment to democracy, the commitment to human rights. It is, in a regional scale, a very interesting experiment, you might say, in multilateralism, bringing together a whole variety of countries and seeing whether they can organize themselves democratically to make decisions. So from a economic perspective, from a political, from a human rights, from a democracy point of view, Europe is absolutely fascinating. The book Euro it was an experiment in a monetary union over a large number of diverse countries. Economists have talked about the possibility of having shared currencies and talked about what conditions were necessary for that kind of shared currency to work well. And so for an economist, this was a very interesting experiment. And Europe didn't satisfy the conditions. They didn't develop the institutions that are necessary, and unfortunately, they still haven't done that, to make a shared currency work. And part of my motivation in writing that book was to hopefully encourage Europe to make the further advances that would allow this kind of regional agreement, a regional political unit, be more successful.
In your book, The Euro, you seem pretty skeptical about the euro's future. And in rewriting the rules of the European economy, you seem to fear that the EU might follow the path of the United States. Why should that worry us? Why should such a trajectory worry us?
Well, as an American, I can tell you I'm very worried about the future of America. We are not, if you look at what's happened in the United States, particularly over the last 40 years, it has not been very good. High levels of inequality. Almost all the growth of the last 40 years has gone to the people at the top 1%. Top 1/10 of 1%. Life expectancy in the United States today is lower than in any of the other advanced countries, and lower today than it was, say, 5 years ago. Health disparities are enormous. COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses in our society. It has shown one of the reasons that we have been so badly afflicted. 3% of the world's population, 25% of the cases, is because of these huge disparities in income and health, lack of trust in government, lack of respect for each other. Clearly, I think anybody looking at what has been happening to our economy, to our democracy, would be worried and would not want that to happen in Europe. So as an American, I look particularly across the Atlantic and say, you are the hope for democracy and human rights. Hopefully, we'll have a renewal in the United States come November, but we won't know for another few weeks.
Taking all these things into consideration, do you still retain a belief in capitalism?
Oh, I think you cannot run a complex economy, a 21st century economy, without a high degree of decentralization. And part of decentralization is what I would call market economy. In my most recent book, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, I talk about capitalism, but it's a very different kind of capitalism than has prevailed in the past. It's much more like European social democracy. It recognizes that there is a very important role for society, for the collective, for government, for collective action. And that includes investment, public investments in education, infrastructure, health. It includes regulation, restricting pollution, exploitation, making sure the economy is competitive, and making sure that the fruits of our society are widely shared prosperity, and providing, for instance, protection. Whenever we have a crisis, we turn to government. And we've seen what 40 years of denigrating the government in the United States has resulted. A government that was not able to respond to this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. It was a government that wasn't able to respond to Hurricane Katrina, hasn't been able to respond adequately to the wildfires, hasn't responded to the challenge of climate change. So to me, capitalism is part of the answer, but it's a different kind of capitalism than Reagan talked about or Thatcher talked about. It's a tempered capitalism that works for everybody. It's what I call progressive capitalism.
Yeah. During the corona crisis, governments all over the world have been very quick to come with new measures and to increase the money supply worldwide. How do we make sure that the money ends up in the hands of those who most need it?
Well, that's part of good democracy. The point that you're raising is a very important one, that it makes a very big difference where the money goes, both in terms of the revival of our economy and in terms of broader sense of social well-being. One of the things that's been very exposed by COVID-19 is the huge disparities in our society. I mentioned this before. One aspect of these disparities is that while the bottom half of our population, roughly, is living hand to mouth, when they don't get a paycheck, they go hungry. And large fractions of parts of America are going hungry. They don't get the health care they need. At the other part, at the top, people are actually relatively unaffected by COVID-19. And what's remarkable is in the United States, in the second quarter of this year, the savings rate soared to 25%, over 25%. This in a country where the savings rate is normally 2, 3, 4, 5%. And what does that mean? That means money given to the people at the top. They don't need that money. They're not spending the money. They're hoarding that money. They're putting in what we call precautionary balances for an even rainier day. So money that is given to the bottom is desperately needed and is going to be spent. Money given to the top just goes into the bank account. Helps stimulate the stock market.
Yeah.
One of the reasons our stock market is doing so well is all this money is going into these precautionary balances. But that's not making for a strong economy and a strong society.
We've seen these developments both in America and in the EU. One of the policies returning back to Europe is that you propose an EU-wide minimum wage in order, for example, for the money to end up in the good hands. How does such a one-size-fits-all policy square with the diversity of economies that we have within Europe?
Well, the reason we talked about it that way was that it is very important within a political union like the EU that you don't have a race to the bottom. The United States, we face the same kind of issue when we first introduced the minimum wage back in the 1930s. We have large differences in the United States. The South, wages were much lower than in the North and places like New England, New York. In the United States, they decided to have a uniform minimum wage. And it turned out to be of enormous benefit to the poorest parts of the country, because it moved the South away from a dependence on exploiting low wages. And Texas became one of our centers for technology. Georgia did as well. It transformed that poorest part of the country and made them join the rest of the country. And they're still poor, but the gap was reduced. Now, in the case of Europe, there's a real problem of this race to the bottom, and the challenge is to try to create a prosperous Europe across the EU. Now, it may be necessary in the initial stages to have some exemptions, some variations to accommodate the differing circumstances. But the goal should be high wages everywhere.
So during the EU summit in July, the Netherlands called out the need for more market reforms in countries such as Italy and Spain in exchange for loans or grants with regard to the corona crisis. How can we make something of that political reality, with your call for action regarding, on the one hand, a more equal distribution of, for example, the minimum wage in Europe, but also with your call for action regarding less market, a more dampened capitalism?
Well, I think we have to recognize that the weaknesses in both sides of the Atlantic, weaknesses that have led to this huge increase of inequality, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, worse in the United States than in Europe, but also in Europe, is that we've relied too much on unfettered markets. There's a realization that excessive focus on market alone, has not even led to higher economic growth. The era of neoliberalism, where markets were put number one, has been an era in which growth is actually slower than in the decades immediately after World War II. Interestingly, in the United States, among the corporate sector today, there is a rejection of this excessive focus on markets. There's a rejection of the notion that firms, for instance, should just maximize shareholder value. There's a recognition that we have to have a better sense of collective vision, that companies have to pay attention to the environment, to their customers, to their workers, to the communities in which they operate. Shareholders are important, but they're only one part of the stakeholders. And so I think what we've learned, that this kind of neoliberalism focusing on just markets without adequate regulation leads to actually lower growth, with companies focusing on exploitation, whether it's market exploitation of market power, or exploiting the more vulnerable in the way that the auto companies did in selling diesel cars that were polluting the atmosphere, the scandal of Dieselgate, our pharmaceutical companies with the opioid crisis, our food companies that have led to, in the United States, a rash of childhood diabetes by pushing addictive drugs, addictive foods, the financial sector that engaged in predatory lending and abusive credit card practices. What we've seen is that these kinds of exploitative activities do not lead to an increase in the well-being of our society or even economic growth. And what we need is investments in both the private and the public sector and regulation to make sure that growth is for the benefit of everybody. So talk about investments. If we think about why is the United States, for instance, leading in the technology sector? Well, it's because the United States public, the government, made the investments for the internet. Why is it leading in so many areas, in biomedical areas? Well, it's because the government has invested so much in basic research in these areas. So in each of the areas, we need today, I believe, a better balance between the market and the government and civil society and a rich set of other institutional arrangements. The view that we need more governments, I think, more markets and just more markets is I think a short-sighted view and is belied by what has happened over the last 40 years.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Stiglitz. Thank you for your answers. We'll come back to that later on in this night. I'd like to move over to Mr. Herman van Rompuy.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Van Rompuy. In this series, we are discussing what really matters in markets and the long-term challenges for Europe in an economic sense. Now, Mr. Stiglitz spoke about some good policy measures that can be implemented. He also gave a brief analysis of the current situation. Yet, as we all know, it takes a good political climate for these ideas to come to fruition. And I'd like to discuss that with you. In times of crisis, certain unique opportunities arise, obviously. Our young economists fear, however, that after this corona crisis, we will return back to normal. How likely do you think this is going to be in Europe?
First of all, let me say that for me, it's an honor, a pleasure to have a conversation with a real economist. I have a diploma of economist, but I have a lot of respect and admiration even for Professor Stiglitz. He received the Nobel Prize for Economics. That was his personal merit. I had the honor to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the European Union. So I come back to the question, back to normal. Let's first realize that the corona crisis is not over. We are in the second wave. There could be a third wave. We all hope that there will be a vaccine. It will be later than November, I think. But there will be. We will live still 1 year in a very special situation. And even after that, we can overcome the corona crisis. There would be, of course, no back to normal. And even before the corona crisis, we had a lot on our agenda, also in the European Union. The Green Deal and the efforts that the European Union is making for the ecological and digital transformation, it was about transformation. It was not about back to normality. So this is the efforts after corona crisis will join the efforts that were already on the political agenda before March or February of this year. We are in the midst of a transformation process. And also for the Europe as an economic and monetary union, we are at the beginning of the creation of a genuine economic and monetary union. We realized already parts of the banking union, but there is a huge program for realizing the fiscal union, for realizing the economic union. So there is a lot on our agenda already independent of the corona crisis. So back to normality is the worst thing you can say. Of course, there have to be some return to normality in the sense that people want to live in a world with less uncertainty. We have not the rise of the increase of savings ratios as you have in the United States, because we have a much better social security system. So people are not that anxious compared to the United States, but still there's a lot of uncertainty about the jobs, about the health and all those things. There's also uncertainty about migration. So uncertainty and anxiety are part of our societies. But in general, people want to live in a world with much more certainty also after the corona crisis. And that's something that everybody is longing for. In that sense, I can understand what it is, normality. Normality is with more security and less anxiety.
In times of crisis, not only unique opportunities arise, but also people tend to look at the leaders more for leadership now than ever. What is your general assessment of the leadership that we currently observe within the European Union?
I'm much more positive than most people. And we have seen it recently. Don't forget that what Germany and France proposed in May was implemented 2 months later. So this big initiative of a recovery fund, mainly formed out of grants, of subsidies, of transfers. This was something totally new, and that the European Union could borrow money on the capital markets for financing that kind of recovery funds was totally unexpected. And Germany, which is heavily criticized, by the way, also in the books of Professor Stiglitz, I think he also was surprised about the initiative taken by Germany. And that those two big countries could agree on the recovery fund, and that it was implemented 2 months later was a major achievement. I was responsible for managing the Eurozone crisis. It took me and my colleagues 2 years before we found the turning point. It was in the summer of 2012 when we realized the banking union, part of it, the common supervision, and then it was the European Central Bank took this very special initiative with the famous words of Mario Draghi. But it took us 2 years before we could overcome the Eurozone crisis. Here it took us 2 months before all the 27 countries could agree on such a recovery fund. So this is a testimony that leadership, that we can have leadership in the European Union. The special thing in the European Union is that we have to agree with 27. It's, of course, absolutely key that France and Germany can agree, but it is a necessity. There's a sufficient condition, but not a necessary condition, because we all have to agree. We can only decide in a unanimous way. And we did it after 3 long nights and 4 days, but we did it.
At the same time, at the EU summit, some critics say it was a hard-fought deal, and that some antagonisms arose between the so-called frugal countries and the southern states. And some critics argue at the same time that this shows once again that when push comes to shove, every member state will eventually put its own self-interest first. How does this lack of solidarity square with your optimism?
I don't agree. Only the result counts. Of course, there are always debates, and some are emphasizing what we call responsibility to put your house in order, and some are more emphasizing solidarity. And we always have to find a compromise. But for the future, it's only the result that counts. And history will not recall the long way or the short way to get that kind of compromise. History will only recall the result, and that, for me, that's the good thing. And there are different sensitivities in the Union, between the North and the South, between the West and the East, between the Social Democrats and the so-called conservatives. And I can give you 20 other examples of division. But each time we realized to get a consensus. It was the case in the Eurozone. It was the case when you have to find a solution for the refugee crisis. And now, after the Corona crisis, the recovery, and also we agreed on common solutions. It's always a long way, but I repeat it for the third time, only the result counts.
Well, that's very clear, Mr. Van Rompuy. Thank you. I have another example that I'd like to discuss with you. When you were president of the European Council, you proposed an EU financial transaction tax for the banking system and for the financial system as a whole. Now, almost 10 years later, after you proposed it, it still hasn't come to fruition. Isn't that the example that when we really need to make sure that the financial sector pays up for the things that it has misdone, that the EU has a certain weakness to it, and that it's not able to make sure that these proposals make it and come to full fruition?
It's one of the few ideas that were not realized. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you are exaggerating from your side. You take one example and say that none of our ideas will come to a good end, not at all. Don't forget that the regulation we put on the banking sector was a very, very tough one. Even much tougher than in the United States. So our European banks are complaining that they are too much regulated, and that gives them a competitive disadvantage on the world markets. So we regulated them very thoroughly. And by the way, the commissioner responsible for that was Michel Barnier, who is now the Brexit negotiator. And then we imposed on the banking sector a single surveillance mechanism under the leadership indirectly of the European Central Bank, which was also something that was a complete novelty. So we draw lessons from the banking sector, and we draw much more lessons than you are suggesting. The financial transaction tax, there was an experiment. There was an experiment of 10 countries, some kind of coalition of the willing to introduce that kind of tax. And France and Germany were on the same page almost. But after years of negotiations, they didn't succeed. And there you see also that even if France and Germany are agreeing, that is not a guarantee for a final success. So there was an attempt made. Now there is some kind, not a Tobin tax, or not really a financial transaction tax, but some kind of taxation will be introduced. At least that is the expectation. But as I said, this was part of a bigger package of controlling the financial sector, which brought us at the brink of a total collapse of the financial system worldwide. So we regulated heavily, successfully, even if this crisis, the banking sector, is not part of the problem, is part of the solution. So that many things changed since the banking crisis of 2009, 2010, but that specific point, we couldn't realize it yet.
Yeah, in today's media's climate, the loudest and the shrillest voices often get the most attention, which has arguably contributed to our climate of polarization we find ourselves in these days. One of those voices are the extreme right-wing voices. And I have a question here in the chat by Freek, and he wants to ask you, Mr. Van Rompuy, why do you think that extreme right-wing populism is so popular in Europe? And could there be a relationship with neoliberal capitalism?
Mm-hmm. There are two major countries in the world that are ruled by populists. That is the UK and the United States. They are ruled by populists today. In the European Union, the populists represent less than 20% of the seats in the European Parliament. So I'm not ignoring the problem, but we have to put it also in the right perspective. We had one experiment that was in Italy in 2018. There were two populist parties had at that time an absolute majority in the Italian parliament. That government collapsed after 1 year, and now they have I would even say a traditional government that realized the big thing for Italy, because Italy is one of the big winners of all the discussions on the recovery fund. And so Italy is again anchored in the Eurozone and in the European Union. The problems are not over. We know it. We are very much aware of that. But the populists are not governing Italy, as they are not governing the major countries in the European Union. But of course, we have to combat populism on the political front, but also in terms of policies. It's not only about politics, it's also about policies. And one of the main challenges is how to reconcile the openness of our economies, of our societies, of our democracies, with this deep need of protection. A lot of people in our societies, they are uncertain, as I said, they are anxious, and they want to be protected against real or perceived threats in our society. Unemployment, insecure jobs, massive illegal migration, climate change, terrorism, inequalities, fraud and corruption. In some parts of Europe also there is the Russian threat. So people want to be better protected, and we have to give them that kind of protection. In the corona crisis, it was protecting against this pandemic and providing them with a good health service. In most of the countries, we succeeded. But how to protect people better whilst maintaining open societies, open democracies, and open economies? That's the big, big challenge. And we can only beat populism when we give them that kind of protection.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rompuy.
Yes. Yeah. The bumper. And now it's time to put these two very interesting minds in one realm. So welcome back, Mr. Stiglitz, and you're joining the conversation now. And we hope we can have just a fruitful dialogue between these two men who have such an experience together in rethinking about policies and politics. And let's see what we can co-create the coming half hour with you together. Let me first ask Mr. Stiglitz an open question. Of course, the cri de coeur, Herman van Rompuy ended his contribution in the first part of this evening, was security. We need to give people security, and we need to think of a way to do that in an open society. Do you agree?
I think it's an absolutely essential part. I think there are some other things that I've talked about before. We obviously have to deal with the problems of inequality. But we won't be able to deal with any of the issues of growth and inequality unless we give. And what he was emphasizing is the politics of this. Is we have to give them security. And I think one of the major failures of neoliberalism over the last 40 years is that it took away we weakened the unions that helped workers get more security. We had labor legislation that weakened the bargaining power of workers. At the same time, we gave more power to corporations. In the last few years in the United States, we've, under President Trump, health insecurity has increased. There has been an attack against what we call Social Security, the security of retirement security. It's being attacked. President Bush tried to privatize the retirement programs, and we now realize how bad that would have been, would have left people really bereft after the 2008 crisis. So there's been a real attempt by the conservatives to undermine security.
Yeah, clear.
And
So you could say, yeah.
To an extent.
Oh, sorry. Continue.
I just want to say, to too large extent, the ideas of trickle-down economics fed into this, so that even the Democrats supported some of the weakenings of the security framework in the 90s. But that's changed now. And going forward, I think there's a real recognition of the importance of the security.
Yeah. So would you agree that the neoliberal politics of the last 40 years created that lack of security? And that is why we need to reinvent capitalism, Mr. Van Rompuy. And let me then make it one of the question of the audience, because we get, of course, you would understand dozens of questions. The question from Jim Surius and also from Iris, no last name, is about the responsibility of the European Union to the bigger world. So Iris is asking, isn't Europe social democracy or it's capitalism? Because Mr. Stiglitz made that comparison. Isn't it heavily funded in the exploitations of other peoples abroad? Isn't that still going on up until today? So what is your reflection on the responsibility of the European Union in the broader world?
I will not elaborate on the historical responsibility of European nations in the world. The period of colonialism and imperialism is quite some time behind us. I will not say that Europe is now the ideal soft partner of the soft power in the world, but this period of exploitation and via colonialism, that we left it behind us. And that's one of the advantages of the European Union. When I visited many countries in the world, they were not referring anymore to the past, the colonial past. They were dealing with the European Union, which is something totally new, totally new. Don't forget that the European Union, for instance, is the biggest provider of development and humanitarian aid in the world. Half of development aid and humanitarian aid comes from the European, half of, and I'm speaking now about of the world as a whole. So you have to realize that the notion of Europe changed dramatically in the course of the last 50 or even 70 years. So there's a chapter in our history that is closed, and we opened a new chapter with the European Union. Of course, the European Union has a role to play in the world, and I take one striking example. That's climate change. On climate change, we played a big role as a European Union. We spoke with one voice in the conference in Paris in December 2015. And at that time, with President Obama, the European Union and China, we realized that kind of worldwide agreement to bring the rise of temperature in the neighborhood of 1.5% compared to the pre-industrial levels. And this was a major achievement. And we could speak as a European Union with one voice. Also, we could show that we had results. In 2020, our emissions will be more than 20% lower than what they were in 1990. We did better than our targets. Of course, we are super ambitious now. We want to realize a decrease of more than 50% in 2030, and even going to a climate neutrality in 2050.
Clear.
If we can do something for the world as a whole, if we can do something for the world as a whole, then it's of climate change.
I can imagine that for the years to come. I can imagine that your example in the policy of climate change as an positive example of the leadership of the European Union is there. But of course, if we talk about the future of capitalism, producing a system which is actually dealing with inequality, then it's still a legit question, I think, that are we creating systems which benefits the entire population of the world, right? Jim Suri also asked a question to Mr. Stiglitz about that in our chat, and he says, what is, according to you, a good mechanism to implement, to envision, if we want to think about the future of capitalism, which we are doing, to create a redistribution of wealth on a global level? Because we already talked about the Tobin tax a little bit, but maybe you can answer that question, Mr. Stiglitz. What are instruments we really have to design, imagine, or perhaps implement to create that more equal division of wealth in the world?
Well, first I begin with do no harm, and that's where exactly what we've just been talking about.
Yeah, of course.
If we continue in the direction that we're going on in the environment, we're going to do an awful lot of harm to the rest of the world. So I think it's really important to begin with that. As part of the do no harm, I view the trade and investment agreements that govern the international system have to be fair. President Trump has said the trade agreements have been unfair to the United States. The United States wrote most of those agreements, and there were problems with them. They were unfair to workers in both the developed and developing countries, but they were also unfair to not the United States, but to many of the developing countries. And in a book I wrote called Fair Trade for All, I detailed exactly the kinds of provisions in these agreements that are so unfair to developing countries and emerging markets. There are a couple of other things I think that are really important on the agenda. One is fair taxation on a global level. Multinationals, mostly from the United States and Europe, operate all over the world, and many of them are not paying their fair share of taxes to the poorer countries, to the emerging markets. They've excelled in their ability to avoid and evade taxes, and that includes our digital giants. Another aspect where we can really help the emerging markets in developing countries has to do with debt. The debt burdens that are imposed today on many of the emerging markets and developing countries as a result of COVID-19, they are not going to be able to repay. And yet many of our private creditors are totally unsympathetic and are making unbelievable, outrageous demands of the developing countries and the emerging markets, and basically asking the citizens in these countries to suffer as a result of the imprudent lending on the part of financial markets in the North. Finally, something that I think really could make a big difference is we've created within the IMF something called special drawing rights, a mechanism by which the developing countries and emerging markets can get money they can spend for a whole variety of purposes. There's ability right now, without going back to parliaments, of spending $500 billion. And there's one impediment, and that is the United States. It has the veto power, and it has effectively exercised that veto power. There is in the US Congress today a bill for a $2 trillion expansion of special drawing rights that would be an enormous help, especially in this COVID-19. And many European countries have committed themselves to say that if they get these additional special drawing rights, they will lend or donate those to the developing countries and emerging markets. So we have a framework in which there can be some help, some redistribution. It's not going to create equality, but it's moving in the right direction. And I'm hopeful that after November, there'll be a move that we can undertake this joint effort to try to create a more greater equality across the world.
So moving to one of those policy measures which you mentioned, Mr. Stiglitz, one of the problems of today you mentioned is the immense power of the digital giants. Does a digital dividend help to create a more fair and a digital future? And Mr. Rompuy, maybe you could reflect on that after Ms. Stiglitz as well.
Well, I think the problem of dealing with the digital giants is much deeper than that. I think there has to be a digital tax. Europe has proposed that. The United States has threatened to retaliate. This just highlights the deficiencies in the global framework for taxation of multinational corporations. There needs to be better regulation. Privacy, misinformation, incitement to violence, hate speech, all these are fundamental problems that we are now facing around the world from social media. The data, the particular proposal that you referred to worries me to some extent because it basically doesn't focus on the misuse of the data that companies can get a hold of. You know, I've been with one of the CEOs of one of the internet companies that prided itself that it could buy data. It could buy data from people at a very low price. That people don't understand the value of data, and you can give them their property rights in that data, and it would be able to buy that data for them, and then at a minuscule price. And he was proud about the foolishness of individuals. So what is needed is more than just the issue of compensation through the ownership of the data. What we need is regulation and taxation.
Of course, and Mr. Van Rompuy, because I thought, of course, I know it's not chic as a former lead, a politician, to comment on current leaders, but I thought you're now a free man, right? So you yourself introduced Tobin tax or financial transaction tax. This is a tax possibility, the digital divide. But as Mr. Stiglitz said, what we need is fair taxation in the world. Can you dream on and suggest some things we have to really investigate if we want to transform the current capitalist system and its perverse consequences?
Mm-hmm. I'm not a free man.
Oh.
I will not change my behavior after having left office.
Of course not.
I always speak as if I am still responsible.
Oh, that's
I'm
interesting.
Not, of course,
no.
But that's my way of thinking and my way of speaking.
That's also to protect yourself.
Because it is a little bit what the French would call gratuit, gratis to do after office as if you had no responsibilities in the past.
Clear.
So on the digital, I very much agree with Professor Stiglitz. we were working with the Americans in the framework of the OECD on some kind of digital taxation. It will not succeed, apparently. It could be that some of our countries and even the European Union as a whole will introduce some kind of taxation independent from what's happening in the rest of the world. It will be less effective, of course. It's better to have that kind of taxation on a global scale, or at least at the scale of the industrialized nations organized in the framework of the OECD. So we are working on this, and we will go on with this, because also in our own countries, small and medium-sized enterprises are taxed. And they look at these big international companies, global companies, who paid no taxation at all. And for them, it's also part of the inequalities, an inequality problem. They are paying, and those big ones are not paying at all. And so for interior reasons, we have to put some taxation on those companies. The second part is the regulation. And as you know, that Europe is leading in the GDPR regulation on protecting privacy, protecting data. We set up world standards. A lot of the companies are even taking over our legislation. So that's a part. There are other aspects that we have still to regulate, but this is a very important one. There Europe is leading. And there is this problem of concentration of power.
Yes.
And the commissioner responsible for competition made important declarations a few days ago, because taxation is something that comes after that they have realized those monopoly profits. So you have to tackle oligopolies and monopolies. You have to tackle it in the United States, and you have to tackle them at the European level. There, in ancient times, the United States was taking the leadership in combating that kind of concentration of powers, even inside the state, breaking up even big companies as ITT and others. So we have to put it on the agenda again. The world is ruled now in this crucial area of digital, by a few companies.
Yes.
Most of them American or Chinese. Of course, the frustration also is, and then we have to be honest, that among the 15 biggest digital companies in the world, none of them is European.
No.
That's a frustration. And now one of the ideas is also to create our own European champions, so to speak, because the time for national champions is completely over, not only for Germany and France, of course, for other countries too. So we have to have our own digital companies. But as I said, you have to be honest. Part of the frustration is that they are all American and Chinese.
Yeah. So we have a question here from the audience, from Mark de Hoop to Mr. Stiglitz. Perhaps the problem here is not just the monopoly, but the perverse incentives and ethically undesirable business models that these digital giants have. What can we expect from business leaders, or what do we expect from business leaders in this regard?
Well, there's been a very major change in the official rhetoric of American business leaders. 50 years ago, Milton Friedman, who was the high priest of the right wing ideologue, but a Nobel Prize winner, but then became very much of an ideologue. He argued that companies should pursue one objective and one objective only, which was maximizing shareholder value, maximizing profits. Forget about the environment. He said it was wrong to pay attention to the environment, wrong to pay attention to your workers. If you can screw them over, if you could hurt, whatever makes profits, do it. Well, about a year ago, the Business Roundtable, which is the group of the largest businesses in the United States, circulated a consensus statement saying that was wrong. That corporations should take into account not only the shareholders, but importantly, the environment, customers, of course, but their workers, the communities in which they operate. So the rhetoric has now changed officially. The question is, will they behave in accordance with that? What we've seen from a number of the digital giants, like Facebook, is the answer is no. They made it very clear that in the trade-off between circumscribing misinformation on the internet, on the Facebook, on issues of the Rohingya, on issue of hate speech, on issues of political disinformation, profits trump social responsibility.
Yeah. So
that means there's going to have to be regulation.
Exactly. Yeah, you cannot leave that to the market. And of course, fiscal policies are not the only thing. You're both made very clear in the entire discussion that we need regulation, better policies, right? Not only on the security issue, but also on the concentration of powers in the economy. We need better regulation. That is a very clear point made by the both of you on different subjects. Some policy suggestions were made, as you may remember, all the way in the beginning by our young economist, right? And she had actually 4 recommendations. And of course, she will never have the opportunity again to get your reflection on that. So I wanted to also ask you specifically to respond to her suggestions very shortly. The first one was job guarantee. There was also a question from the audience on basic income. Maybe Mr. Stiglitz can address that because you are for a European-wide minimum wage, right? But basic income is a bit going further on that, and job guarantee, well, an alternative for that. First one, yeah.
Okay, so in my new book, People, Power, and Profits, I actually do come out in support of a guaranteed employment.
Exactly.
What I say is that if the market works well, then there will be jobs for everybody. But what we've seen is the markets often have not worked well, and particularly not worked well for minorities, people of color, for women. So the reality is that we do have to have a guaranteed job. Now, on the issue of UBI, Universal Basic Income, my view is that we have an enormous amount of work that needs to be done. We have to, it's going to take a lot of resources for the green transition. We need to invest in infrastructure, caring for our aged, caring for our young, healthcare. So the first priority at this point is we have a lot of people who want to work, and we have a lot of people who a lot of jobs that need to be done. And our first priority should be to make sure that everybody who is able and willing to work get a job.
Okay, so first priority is more jobs. I know the political Netflix series where America works, a universal right to work or employment. Her second question, maybe Mr. Van Rompuy can take that, or policy suggestion, was to make sure that there isn't a regressive effect on the climate taxes, right? I mean, where also the movement in France of the yellow vests critiqued the effects on, so the idea of a just transition or a fair climate policy. And she was thinking whether there could be distributional effects or mechanisms within climate taxation. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. In some way, in France, they are putting into practice that kind of idea. Mm-hmm. So they raised indirect taxes that created this almost not a real revolution, but something similar, what is called the Yellow Vest movement. And then President Macron had to react. And one part of his reaction is that he decreased personal taxation for the French taxpayers, and especially for those who are at the bottom of the income brackets. So in some way, what your colleague is suggesting is already put into practice. It shows also in the Yellow Vest movement how high fairness and combating inequalities already were on the political agenda before the corona crisis. It's one of the big issues. Mm-hmm. Brexit, if you look at the figures of the income levels of some parts of England that are in favor of Brexit, then you see that inequalities is one of the big explanations of the Brexit movement. So social justice is, even before Corona, is a real issue in our societies. It's not the only driver, but it's one of the drivers of populism. And so all governments have to take this into account. And that's why at the European level, this recovery fund was so important, giving money, literally giving money to those countries who had the most problems, as most of them in the south of Europe. And that is the recovery. There is a dimension of fairness and equality built in. So we have to reconcile recovery, climate change, and inequalities.
Yes.
That's part of the same endeavor, and that's a big change with the past. In the past, it was recovery was we build roads, we create harbors, and so on, infrastructure. Now we try to reconcile short-term recovery with longer-term objectives, climate change, and more fairness in our society. It is a unique opportunity, and I think I cannot speak about the United States, and we hope that the world will change after November. But in Europe today, there is a strong awareness that we have to proceed in that way.
Yeah.
And the European budget was already gave already evidence to that, because there are real priorities: the digital and the ecological transformation. And in the recovery fund, they put the priorities of the European budget in this new initiative.
Yeah.
And that's why that makes me happy that leadership is not only let's say trying to find solutions for the short term. Sometimes we have to overcome the Eurozone crisis, but never lose sight of the longer term objectives.
Yeah, Mr. Stiglitz, Elisa was already mentioning that, right? As examples, the policies of France and Germany, but also the recovery fund. You also made a survey on that, right? The right recovery policies. What can we learn from your survey in reimagining, rethinking, for instance, a better European policy, a better, fairer economy? What have you deduced from your survey which we can learn from?
Well, one of the things that I think we emphasize is that there's not a real trade-off here. That these long-term vision that we were talking about, a greener, build back greener, build back more equal. I would also say build back more of a knowledge-based economy. That can be done in a way which makes the recovery happen faster and better, so that those kinds of expenditures have can be very timely. They can be labor intensive, which means the demand for labor will go up, and that will drive up wages. And can have high multipliers. That means the amount of the bang for the buck or the bang for the euro is going to be very high. So that we can achieve all these goals at the same time. They're not really a trade-off if we think about it very carefully. And it's both on how the green money is spent, the recovery money is spent, but it's also some of the conditions that are imposed. France, for instance, said when it gave money to the airlines, you have to reduce your carbon footprint. Never has society provided as much money for the economy as it has done in this post-COVID-19 world. And to me, that seems to mean that citizens should have a right to shape the economy in accord with our values and our vision of the kind of future that we want.
Yeah, beautifully. Well, I'm really after. Thank you so much. We're now going to ask Elisa to actually comment on what you heard from you distinguished speakers. Please stay tuned because maybe she has a question for you left. But for now, I really want to say thank you for taking the effort to be here in this program, the first where we are trying to rethink capitalism. Let's see the bumper and let's go to Elisa. Yeah, Elisa, you kickstarted this conversation. What is your first response?
Well, it's a lot to take in.
Mm-hmm.
So I see an overall agreement between both speakers on that indeed we need more government and more investment, more reform, more regulation. But when I come back to the sort of main question that I tried to raise with the column at the beginning, which is how do we really, reconcile these concepts of, so how do we take action in the short term to achieve economic recovery post-crisis? How do we reconcile that with our great progressive ambitions for structural change in the system, right? I think that the question still remains, and that it sort of comes across to me as, when are we going to start talking about growth? When is that going to come into the question?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So can you reconcile this, as Mr. Stiglitz called it? There is you can combine these things, huh? You can combine long-term goals with recovery. You say, I'm not convinced yet, and I'm wondering whether the elephant in the room, the goal of economic growth, can be in that mix, right? Shall we ask him a short response?
Totally.
We only have 3 minutes left, Mr. Stiglitz, so I have to ask you to be incredibly short. But we haven't talked about an elephant in the room. That's our mistake, of course, because I didn't ask that question. But can you respond quickly?
So growth has very many different meanings. So when I talk growth, I just mean increases in standards of living. Yeah. And we can increase standards of living in ways that are not requiring more material goods that have an adverse effect on our environment, lead to more carbon emissions. We can increase standards of living in many ways that actually are consistent with reducing our carbon footprint.
So that means we have to talk first, what do you mean with growth? So, and we don't have time today, but we should put it on the agenda if we reimagine capitalism.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, and that is a very clear point and a very good suggestion from Mr. Stiglitz, right? So we talked a bit about your suggestions, right? I asked the gentleman to respond to that. What do you think about that?
I took note of one specific thing that Mr. Van Rompuy referred to, and it seems quite interesting how now restrictions, or so to say structural reforms, are being imposed on corporations when, a couple of decades back, it was the other way around, right? The rich countries lending poor countries and putting structural reforms towards them. Now being the other way around in the example of France in the airline industry. I don't know, it sounds promising and hopeful, I guess.
I'm also, I started a bit depressed with this session, but now I'm much more hopeful. What did you think, David? It's a good first evening, right, to talk about rethinking capitalism.
I think a lot of interesting things have come to the table, and I'm really looking forward to take some of these themes forward as we move forward into the next discussion next week and over the coming weeks. Moreover, I think I've heard a lot of things. Also, some things which I'd like to dig in maybe a little bit more deeper. I've heard, for example, that Mr. Rompuy said that this time the banking system is part of the solution.
Yes.
And I was wondering actually what Mr. Stiglitz's view on that is, but currently we don't have time for that, so maybe another time. But I'm wondering maybe we can dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, afterwards in the chat. For now we only had 1 hour, so and we tried to get most of it, and you really helped us a lot, Mr. Van Rompuy and Mr. Stiglitz, for giving such elaborate but short answers. Thank you. Tremendous respect for both of you to do that. Next week, will we be back with the second edition of this series, and we will talk to Rebecca Henderson and Colin Meyer. Check in at 6:30 next Monday if you want to see that, and find coming editions of these series online through dezwijger.nl, a Dutch website, or the Future Markets consultation, and then you have to go to moralmarkets.org/future markets consultation. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Please, if you want to share new topics we have to talk about in this series, share them with us. And for now, thank you for existing and giving all your thoughts to us. And for the watchers, thank you so much for watching.